Good morning, student. Today we'll start a new chapter, that is nervous system. Last time we completed circulatory system, and after that we have only one chapter, that is cell division. Okay, to start, nervous system comprises of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, then first we start with the central nervous system. Central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is covered by a membrane called meninges, important term, and further protected by the cranium. Cranium is the bones of the skull. The brain is divided into four parts. They are cerebrum, cerebellum, pons, and medulla. The cerebrum constitutes the major portion of the brain, and it consists of two hemispheres, but internally it is interconnected by a sheath of nerve fibers called corpus callosum, another important term. Then within the brain you find cavities called ventricles containing nutritive fluid. Now, and which nourishes the cells of the brain. The main function of the cerebrum is to control all voluntary actions. Voluntary actions means those actions which we perform with our consciousness. And it also controls, and it is also the seat of intelligence, consciousness, memory, reasoning, etc. It also interprets various senses such as taste, etc. Taste, sight. Now, these are the main functions of the cerebrum. I have already dealt with the ventricles and the fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. So these are the overall function of the cerebrum. Within the cerebrum, we find a structure called thalamus. If you see the longitudinal section of the brain, within the brain you find thalamus. It is a nerve sheath that controls the ingoing and outgoing impulse to and from the cerebrum. Now, what is impulse? Impulse is a electrochemical message that passes through the nerves. Below that you find hypothalamus, which is the regulatory center. It controls sex, hunger, body temperature, etc. So at least learn the major parts, function, terms, connected, and one function each. Lying below and behind the cerebrum, you find cerebellum. The main function of cerebellum is to maintain the balance of our body. Now, in front, below you find pons. These pons interconnect the two halves of the body and brings about coordination among the two halves of the muscles of our body. Below, the most posterior part of the brain is called medulla. It's the lower part of the brain. It controls the working of the heart and the lungs. So overall, cerebrum controls all voluntary action. Cerebellum maintains the balance of our body. pons coordinate the muscular organ on the two sides of the body, and medulla, the lower part of the brain, which controls the working of the heart and the lungs. Now, the downward elongation or prolongation of the medulla or the brain is called spinal cord. It is well protected by the backbone, somewhere here in backbone or the vertebral column. And spinal cord controls the ingoing and outgoing impulses to and from the brain, and it acts as a reflex center. I'll be explaining you what is a reflex action, voluntary action later on. So you must know what is spinal cord and its function. Next, neuron. Neuron is the structural and functional unit of the nervous system. And what is a nerve? Nerve is a collection of nerve fibers or neurons. Now, the structure of a neuron. It consists of the cell body and attached to two fibers, dendron and axon. This one is the axon, this one is the dendron. Dendron brings impulse towards the cell body, and axon carries the impulse away from the cell body. Once again, impulse is an electrochemical message that passes through the nerve, and nerve is a collection of neuron or nerve fibers, and axon carries impulse away from the. Now this impulse travels at a very high speed of about 150 meters per second. But now how it travels? There is no continuity between the two neurons. Instead, there is a space called synaptic cleft. How? There is no connection. How can impulse pass through? Now see here. Dendron brings impulse towards the cell body, axon carries impulse away, and this axon ends up with bulb-like structures called presynaptic knobs. Within the presynaptic knob, vesicles are there containing a chemical transmitter called acetylcholine or ACH. When this impulse reaches the vesicle will burst and release the ACH in the gap, and this ACH stimulates the neighboring dendrites of the neighboring cell body, and so it passes from one neuron to another neuron. This ACH are immediately after release, they are destroyed. Otherwise, the same impulse will keep on passing. So synapse is the space between two neurons where impulse is passed from one neuron to another neuron. Now to come to the next point. Once again, neuron. Neuron is the structural and functional unit of the nervous system. There are three types of neurons: sensory neuron, motor neuron, and association neuron. Sensory neuron brings impulse from the sense organ to the central nervous system, mainly to the spinal cord, and central nervous system comprises of the brain and the spinal cord. This one is a cross section of a spinal cord. Now, the neurons in the brain towards the periphery are grayish in color and they are called gray matter. Lying below the gray matter, you find neurons insulated with fat, so it gives a white appearance. That is called white matter. The brain is made into folds and convolution so that it can be accommodated within the small space of the cranium. The IQ of a person or intelligence depends on the number of folds and the gray matter in the brain. Now, in the spinal cord, gray matter is inside and white matter is outside. But in brain, gray matter is outside, white matter is inside. So now the different types of neurons: sensory neuron, motor neuron, and association neuron. Sensory neurons, they carry impulse from sense organ to the central nervous system, for example, spinal cord. Motor neurons, they carry impulse away from the central nervous system to the muscles or effector. Association neuron transmits the impulse from sensory neuron to the motor neuron. Altogether, the nerves that arise from the spinal cord are called spinal nerve, and they are there are 31 pairs, and those nerves which arise from the brain are called cranial nerves, and they are 12 pairs. Now, voluntary action and involuntary actions. Voluntary actions are those actions which we perform with our consciousness. For example, picking up an apple and eating. All this process, it works under our consciousness. And whereas involuntary action or reflex action is an action which takes place without our consciousness. For example, if you touch a hot object, you suddenly leave without thinking. It's an example of reflex action. Now, the reflex arc. This diagram represents the reflex arc. Here is the cross section of a spinal cord. It has two roots, dorsal root and ventral root. And see, gray matter is inside, white matter is outside. Now, sense organ, they are distributed in the skin, and the path through which the stimulus passes is called reflex arc. This diagram represents the reflex arc, and it's important. Now, sense organ are situated, sense organ of pain, heat, etc. are situated in the skin. For example, the sense organ of heat are scattered in the skin. This sense organ picks up the stimuli. For in this case, the stimuli is the heat, picks up the stimuli, and through sensory neutron, it is transmitted to the association neuron. From the association neuron, it is transmitted to the motor neuron, to the muscles, where the action takes place. For example, if I pinch is the stimulation is passed through motor neuron to the central nervous system, interpretation takes place, and this sends the impulse to the muscles. For example, the muscles will contract and make the movement, like when you touch a hot object, you remove your hand. So these are the different parts of the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system we'll do in the next class. So main important points to remember: a brain is covered by a membrane called meninges and further protected by a bony structure called cranium. Its main function is to control all voluntary actions. Cerebellum, lying behind, it helps to maintain the balance of our body. Pons helps to coordinate the working of the muscle on the either sides of the body. Medulla controls the working of the heart and the lungs, internal organs. This cerebrum consists of two halves, but internally it is connected by a sheath of nerve cells called corpus callosum. This term is important. Within the brain, there are cavities. These cavities are filled with a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid, which is a nutritive in function. The neurons on the outer surface of the brain are grayish in color, and they are called gray matter. And lying below the gray matter, you find neurons white in color due to the fatty insulation. It's called white matter. Now, internal part of the brain, within the brain you find thalamus. Thalamus is the relay center. It controls the ingoing and outgoing impulses to and from the brain. Hypothalamus, lying just below the thalamus, which is a regulatory center. It controls sex, thirst, etc. Now, structure of a neuron. It consists of the cell body, two fibers, dendron, axon. These dendrons bring impulse towards the cell body, and axons carries impulse away from the cell body. Nucleus, Nissl granules. Now, synapse is the space between two neurons where impulse is passed from one neuron to another neuron. There's no continuity between the two neurons. So how does the impulse pass from one neuron to another? And this, as I told you, travels at a very high speed of about 150 meters per second. Now the impulse, as it passes through, it reaches the knobs called presynaptic knobs. Within the presynaptic knobs, you find vesicles contain ACH molecules. When the impulse reaches the vesicle, the ACH molecules are released into the space, which will stimulate the dendrons of the neighboring neuron. Then the terms like what is neuron, what is a nerve, then spinal nerve, cranial nerve. Spinal nerves are nerves which arise from the spinal cord, and cranial nerves are nerves which arise from the brain. 12 pairs spinal nerves, 31 pairs. Now, there are three types of neurons: motor neurons, sensory neuron, and association neuron. Sensory neurons carry impulse from the sense organ to the central nervous system. Motor neurons carry impulse from the central nervous system to the muscles. Now, in a diagram, how to identify which one is a sensory neuron, which one is a motor neuron. If the arrow is coming from sense organ to the central nervous system, that is sensory neuron. Because sometimes they don't give the name, they show with the arrow. And if you see an arrow coming from central nervous system to the muscle, that is the motor neuron. If the arrows are reversed, the whole naming systems will change. So be careful, see the arrows, don't mug up, because this one is sensory neuron up and motor neuron down. You see the arrows will change the whole thing. So overall, This one is a reflex arc. You must know the definition, the path through which the stimulus passes and the working of the parts of the reflex arc. Voluntary action, involuntary actions. Voluntary actions are those actions which we perform with our consciousness, and involuntary actions which we perform without our consciousness. Examples I've already given you, and you find more examples in your notes. Okay, this much for today. We'll do next class, peripheral nervous system.